Hey guys, I'm Bryn. I'm a digital illustrator. I do things like concept art for production companies, music, album covers, concept art for music videos, board games, quite a lot of different things that involve illustration. So I've been drawing and painting for about 15 years now. I showed someone my art for the first time when I was 20 and they really liked it. So from then on I just really enjoyed showing people my art. So I kept doing it. And I've progressed. I've gone quite far over the years. Like when I started, my art was very different to how it is now. When I was starting out, I really wanted to get into the comic book industry. So I spent quite a few years drawing comics, but I had more success doing painting. So things like video game concept art, things like that. I think the line art in comic books just didn't work very well with my thought process. I really struggled with things like knowing when to do hatching and different line thicknesses. But painting things without outlines, I discovered I was fairly good at, so I went more down that route. I spent a good few years painting things by hand the difficult way, so just gathering references around the canvas and then doing everything by hand. But eventually I realised that if I combined painting with photo editing, I could get a really nice concept art look. And I discovered that actually that's how a lot of people in the concept art industry do it. They take photos and paint over them, or they do photo bashing, or they take parts of photos and put them in their work. So when I discovered that you could do that as an artist, my art just went in a much better direction very quickly. Before doing any photo bashing or photo editing, it was still worth me learning how to draw and paint without doing those things. So it was good to have that as a background, but now I do things to really aid my illustration process. One of my friends was making an independent video game and I really wanted to join in and help him. So I needed to get into 3D to do that. So I actually bought a PlayStation VR headset and started sculpting in VR. That's quite an easy way to get into 3D because navigating the space and adding and taking away material in VR is quite intuitive, and it's just an easy way to get into 3D work. I would then take the VR sculpts and put them on my desktop and tidy them up. And because I was doing the desktop tidying up part so much, I actually eventually transitioned into doing 3D on my desktop, which is how the professionals do it, I guess. And so because I wanted to get involved in my friend's video game, I just became very confident and competent with 3D on my desktop. So now I had the option of painting over 3D work instead of painting over photographs, and there were loads of advantages to that. So finding the right photo online can be quite a difficult process. If I was doing some concept art for a company, there would be points where I'd spend like an hour or 2 hours just researching the right photos that I could use in my work. Whereas with 3D, I could build things fairly quickly or buy 3D assets online, and then the process was just a lot smoother. And although the end result was kind of similar, like my old strictly 2D stuff was very nice and my 3D stuff for a while was not so good, but the process itself was just so much easier and it gave me more freedom to take 3D work and use that to create concept art. My schedule is very tight these days because of my young family and because I have lots of clients and lots of projects ticking over in the background. So being able to work quickly by reusing 3D stuff and then doing a really quick, speedy part of 2D in Affinity Photo, it's really beneficial to be able to work quickly. If I was spending like a whole day or 3 days on one illustration, it would just be so difficult to work. So I currently do a mix of client work and my own IPs. So for clients, I do things like podcast illustrations, and I've done concept art for music videos. So I've worked for a group of producers called QCODE Media, and they create podcasts which sometimes get taken into TV productions. So I do early concept art for those things. I've done podcast covers for Audible, and including some promotional artwork for Audible. And I've also worked for Island Records doing concept art for their music videos for very well-known artists, but I can't really talk about that because of all the agreements I've signed. And then I have a publisher called Andrews McMill who published my tabletop role-playing game book. And that book has launched very recently, so I'm quite excited about that. And then I work on my own projects. Well, that book is my own project, but I have another project which is an animated movie. So I've been learning animation this year, decided to make a short movie, and that is going quite well, although it is an insane amount of work. But it is progressing very nicely and it looks quite good, so I'm quite happy with that. Quite a lot of people ask me about my education. So I didn't do university, I didn't do any kind of big formal education. I spent, say, 60 quid doing a course at a community college, which is just a very informal handful of sessions. And then I've bought books and I've bought tutorials on Gumroad from different artists. The Gumroad tutorials are probably where I've learnt the most because you're looking at how someone in the industry works. So those kinds of tutorials online are really good. In terms of whether or not university is worth doing, there are really big advantages like having the guidance, having a better idea of the industry because you're talking to people in that world, and having peers who are studying with you because they could get into the industry and they could give you advice and help you get in as well. But I didn't do it, and it is crazy expensive, so it's hard to know. Like, I've only spent about £400 on my art education and I managed to get into it. But it just did take me a very long time. When I did start working as an artist, I slowly got approached by different companies. So I was getting approached by board game companies, and I was attending a lot of comic conventions. So I did have a handful of very amateur comics, and the work I did find, it was because of the painted illustrations on the cover. So I would go to conventions and try and make contacts and get work, but eventually conventions just became far too time consuming. Like, it takes up your whole weekend, you have to do preparation, you're paying, like, at the time it was about 100 quid just to be there, and you would try and make back the money on sales, but it just became a really huge commitment. I get quite a lot of job offers because people see me a lot on Instagram, and it can appear quite vain to focus on following, but it does actually totally determine how well my business is going. So I'm very much obsessed by trying to get more followers on Instagram. And the first year, I think I got to about 70,000 followers, and then the second year was a bit slower because my branding went all over the place. I kind of lost direction a little bit. So the second year wasn't as big, but then this recent year I'm back on it and really focusing on my social media, and I got 150,000 new followers in the first half of the year, so that's all going quite well. I do feel like I'm one of those people that's constantly on my phone and obsessed with social media, but it gives me a lot of opportunities with my work, so I'm fine making that sacrifice. At first, it felt quite unusual talking to strangers on social media. It just felt a bit uncomfortable probably for the first year. And then it got to a point where I really enjoyed responding to people's comments and talking to people I don't know. I guess I just started treating people the same way, so treating people as if they were a friend of mine and not worrying about who they are as a person before I engaged with them. So I actually quite like responding to comments and joking around and talking to people on Instagram, and it's good for my following because it's good to have that engagement. But I don't find the responding to comments a chore anymore. I actually quite enjoy doing that kind of thing now. So that's a bit about me and my work. I'll talk about Affinity Photo now. I use loads of different software when I work. I use a range of 3D software, including animation software and AI motion tracking things. Just loads of different types of things to create art and animations. But for anything two-dimensional, I use Affinity Photo. When I was starting out, I had a copy of Photoshop and it was very expensive. I'd saved up for it for a long time, and then they moved to subscription and I was like, well, that's just even more money. So I'd heard that Affinity Photo was a good alternative, and it's brilliant. It does everything I need it to do. It has all the different tools I need, and it's for like a reasonable amount of money. So I was very happy to make the switch over to Affinity Photo, and I'll show you how I use it now. I'll give a few different examples of how I use it and some general controls that I use. I'll give you a few examples of how I use Affinity Photo, but first I'll show you the main brush I use. I created this flat brush that fades with pressure. So by pressing lightly, I can just lay a little bit of paint down. It just changes the opacity of the brush. So that's really useful for when I'm mixing colors. And I press the Alt key to select the colors that are directly below the cursor. I don't want to have to navigate over to the menus all the time to select colors. So using the Alt hotkey is really useful. When I do sketches for clients, Affinity Photo has some really useful brushes that I can use. So I use a dry brush to create like a pencil-y looking line. So when I'm doing little line drawings and sketches for clients, it's really nice to be able to use those built-in brushes. Here's an example of a 3D render that I'm going to paint over. So things like the waterfall here, to get the details on that in 3D would take a very long time. So it's nice to be able to do this in 2D very quickly. I'm actually going to use one of the dry brushes because that has a broken, splashy texture to it. On the waterfall here, you wouldn't really have clear cast shadows, so I'm just going to break those shadows up slightly. Water is very hard to do in 3D. It's actually very complex, so I just create a simple reflective metallic shader in 3D and then add all the details. If I go into the basic brushes, there's some airbrushes, so I can add some spray from the water down here. Small details like this are just so much quicker when working in Affinity, and adding people in 3D can take a while as well, so I'll just quickly add them like this. When I'm creating flags and banners, you can use the freehand select tool. That's probably a bit big. Let's make it a bit smaller. I find that 3D often feels a bit lifeless, so bringing things to life when you're painting can really improve the image. Let's add some guys on this bridge up here as well. With this image, I have the mood and the foreground done in 3D, but I need to make some heavier edits to this. So first I'll take the levels and make those highlights brighter. I'm also going to create a new layer, take the fill tool, and I'm going to fill the layer with a dark brown. Change the layer mode to lighten, and there you see I've lifted up all the blacks. It's got that Instagram style filter effect. I'm then going to take a nighttime photo. Let's copy that in. So I have permission to use this photo. It's from a website that allows me to do stuff like this. It's very risky to take photographers' work and use it in yours if you don't have permission. So this is all okay. I have permission to do this. So I've pasted the photo in and changed the layer mode to lighten, and then I can create these highlights in the distance. Just going to erase parts I don't need. I'm going to change the color of that highlight layer as well. So if I go to color balance, I can then drag that adjustment onto that layer so it only affects that layer. And I'm going to give these a bright orange kind of recoloring with color balance. Oh, made a mistake there and I started erasing the adjustment layer. I actually wanted to erase this layer, so let's try again. There we go. I can merge these layers together by right-clicking and selecting Merge Down. If you try and merge layers that have different blend modes, sometimes you'll get an error, but these are all set to lighten, so they merge together perfectly fine. I'm pressing Control with the move tool. I can press Control and that duplicates that layer. Okay, so the next thing I'll do with this image is I'll create some cables, and there's a really useful tool that Affinity has called the stabilizer. So with the stabilizer, let's create a new layer. With the stabilizer, I can create these really nice, neat curves. And I can create some cables like this. That's a really useful tool. Without it, it would be a bit more... It wouldn't look as good, would it? It would look like that. So the stabilizer is really useful. I'll give you one more example because people often ask me how I do clouds. And I create clouds by using a 3D shape. It's a sphere that I've sculpted and added blobs to, so it's these blobby shapes here, and I light them in 3D, and then I take them into Affinity Photo. I just add a bit of texture like this with my flat brush. So the calculating the light is all done in 3D, which is really quick and very accurate in terms of how light behaves. And then I can add the flare and the texture in Affinity Photo. So small shapes would take a long time in 3D. Small bits of cloud, so it's nice to be able to add those in, make the whole thing look a bit finer. As I said earlier, I press the Alt key to select the color, so I can work the negative shapes by selecting the blue and cutting back in. And again, with this image, I would probably create a new layer, take the fill tool, fill the layer with a dark brown or a dark red, change the layer mode to lighten. It's only a very slight adjustment, but it just compresses the colors in a really nice way. With digital art, I'm looking to compress the colors, so I'll lift the blacks and I'll use fewer types of color, so I'm muting the color palette. When you go into a TV store, they're always like, we've got the darkest blacks and the brightest white and a really high contrast ratio. But actually, with digital painting, that's not what I'm looking for, because I think I can get a nicer effect if I make it more like an oil painting where the colors are very close together and the colors are related to each other and mixed together. I just think it looks nicer like that. Occasionally I'll use textures in my work, so it's really handy to have Affinity Photo so I can use the brightness and contrast to change the images into something that I can use in my 3D work. Another really useful tool is the text tool, because sometimes I'll be creating graphics for a Kickstarter project. A couple of years ago I was creating art books, and I actually used another Affinity product, Affinity Publisher, to put the art books together. So because I knew that software was so good, I thought Affinity Photo would be worth a try. So that's about it from me. I hope you've found this video helpful. I hope you've enjoyed me going on about how I do digital art. And thanks Affinity Photo for doing this with me. It's been a really good experience. So take care, guys.